Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's afternoon for all of us, no matter where we are in Canada. Evening has not arrived yet, and we're beyond the morning. So welcome, and it's good to see all of you for this webinar that we're having with Peter Bisson and Susan Wood on the apostolic exhortation by Pope Leo and begun by Pope Francis, Dilexi Te on love for the poor, an Ignatian perspective. So before we begin formally with an introduction, I would just like to hand it over to my colleague, Stan, my Jesuit Forum colleague, to start us off with a brief opening prayer and land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Trevor. So let's begin by acknowledging that the Jesuit Forum is based in Toronto. We're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this beautiful land with gorgeous trees and lakes, with an amazing community of life. We thank those who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. The Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. We acknowledge that Toronto is now home to many Indigenous peoples, and we acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I am personally very grateful to be able to raise my children here and to be able to develop relationships with Anishinaabe people and other Indigenous people through my work. I hope my family and our community will grow more and more conscious and appreciative of this land, of its Indigenous history, presence, and wisdom. And I pray that we can always have in mind that it's thanks to the Creator that we have access to all this in common. And I pray that today's event is an inspiration for us all to become more and more respectful of the creation, of one another, faithful to Jesus' style. And now, if you wish to do so, you could share your own land acknowledgement or even a prayer in the chat.
Thank you, Stan. And as you're entering in your own, where you come from, sharing of the Indigenous lands in which you presently reside, call home, I'll continue with our introduction. I don't think I introduced myself, actually. A lot of you know me, but my name is Trevor Scott, and I'm the director of the Jesuit Forum. And it was a few months ago that we had this idea for this webinar on not too long after it came about on Dilexi Te, I Have Loved You. And as many of you may know, even if you haven't read it yet, it's a message, Pope Leo's message of God's love for the most vulnerable and marginalized people in our midst. And it's an exhortation for us to give witness to the same love. It reminds us that love and care for our impoverished neighbours is a fundamental part of our faith, and that if we are to remain a people faithful to the gospel, we must be a poor church for the poor, upon which our credibility lies. In the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits and all Ignatian-rooted peoples have striven to take this identification with the poor as a fundamental aspect of our apostolate seriously. I like to think that our social faith and justice towards the poor and marginalized is not just merely one apostolate among many, such as parish ministry or teaching ministry, but it's an integral orienting commitment to all of our ministries. It's the heart of the gospel, not just one part of the gospel. And so our personal faith is intricately entwined with being socially conscious of this, rooted in God's love for each of us. So the love of the poor that Pope Leo encourages us to deepen must be an essential dimension of our faith lives rooted in the Gospels. And I thought it was I'm really delighted to have Susan and Peter with us to deepen this awareness. And so I'm just about to hand it over to them. But first, I'll introduce them. a little bit for those of you who don't know them. Sister Susan Wood is a sister of charity from Leavenworth, Kansas. And she is currently a professor of systematic theology at Regis College, which is part of the University of Toronto and Toronto School of Theology. She's also very recently the acting president. So very grateful to have Susan with us because she has a lot of administrative responsibilities that has just been recently placed upon her desk. And a part of me was waiting for an email saying, Trevor, I'm too busy to remain committed to this. But so thank you, Susan, for for still keeping your time in the schedule for us. Susan, very active in ecumenical work, with the Lutheran Roman Catholic dialogue, Orthodox Roman Catholic, Baptist Roman Catholic dialogue. She's a published author, fairly recently, A Synodal Church, The Christian Faithful on Pilgrimage. And she co-wrote most recently with Timothy Wingert, A Shared Spiritual Journey, Lutherans and Catholics Traveling Toward Unity. And not too long ago, a few years ago, she received the John Courtney Murray Award from the Catholic Theological Association of America in recognition of, quote, outstanding and distinguished achievement in theology, unquote. So we're really pleased to have Susan with us, especially given her new responsibilities. And then Peter Bisson is a Jesuit priest with the Jesuit Province of Canada, former provincial a few years ago of the English Canadian province, just prior to formerly the French and English provinces coming together. So Peter was instrumental in our two provinces becoming a new province, a single province in Canada. Peter's very active among Indigenous peoples and communities seeking truth and reconciliation. And he was instrumental in expressing a public apology to Indigenous peoples on behalf of the province of English Canada, formerly, for the historical role Jesuits played in their participation with residential schools, and wanting to be public about acknowledging our role, and to apologize for this. His educational background, Peter's, is in the development of social faith through post-Vatican II general congregations of the Society of Jesus. So really help, learning about and helping to continue to promote social faith as an integral part of the apostolates of the Society of Jesus internationally. And he's been active in promoting the important role of communal discernment towards consensual decision-making among organizations and religious and social communities. And presently, Peter is based in Winnipeg as an associate pastor of our parish in Winnipeg, St. Ignatius Parish, and teaching at the University of Manitoba, St. Paul's College, and various other endeavors, I'm sure. And he's also the associate assistant to the Jesuit Provincial for Justice and Indigenous Relations. So they could say more about themselves if they like, but that's just an overview of both the background of Susan and Peter, and this is what they bring with them in their reflections with us on Dilexi Te. So just a word about our format. So now we're going to move, Susan is going to start us off, and then we'll go back to Peter, over to Peter for his reflection on Dilexi Te, and then we'll go back to Susan again. And then we will enter into question mode. And I'll start us off with questions, kind of as a moderator, I guess you could say. And then we'll open it up to all of you, for any of you who have questions for Susan and Peter on their presentation on Dilexi Te in general, from the Ignatian perspective. And we'll do our best to answer your questions and have a very enriching time together. So I leave it Susan and Peter. Susan, and at this particular moment, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you. If you noticed how the volleyball goes across the net, most of your questions have to go to Peter. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I presume you can all see that.
Yes.
Okay, the reason I'm going first is I'm going to just kind of go through a bird's eye view of the document in case you haven't read it. And so I'll start out by saying, what is it? Okay, you know, most church documents have these lovely Latin titles. This one is Dilexi Te, which means I have loved you. It's Pope Leo XIV's first apostolic exhortation. It's practically hot off the press because the publication date was October 4th, 2025, not so long ago. And what's interesting about this document is that it was a draft that was begun by Pope Francis, and Leo completed it. That's not unusual because Pope Francis had finished a document at the beginning of his pontificate that had been initially drafted by Benedict. So there's good overlap between the popes and the documents that come from them. The title actually comes from Revelation chapter 3, verse 9. I have loved you. And it emphasizes Christ's personal declaration of love. This document is not just directed to Catholics, but rather to all Christians. And it continues the theme of a document by Pope Francis, which was Dilexi Nos. Nos in Latin is us. So it means he has loved us. This document is I have loved you. Notice that it's direct address. It's not just talking about the love of Christ for somebody, but for us in particular. And so what it's trying to do is to illuminate the inseparable connection between Christ's love and the themes and care for the poor. So the love is the central theme of the document. It's a call to love the poor. It's a universal moral appeal in that it's directed to all people, all Christians, and it is an urgent moral summons in our day. In this, the Christology of the document is central because it begins with Christ's love as the foundation. And that is the wellspring or the source of commitment to the poor and the call for conversion. So he starts with Christology, and the emphasis is on Christ, who was divine, did not cling to divinity, but became human, took on the form of a slave. And this is what's called divine reversal, that which is divine, emptying oneself and becoming human. And this reversal is going to be connected with works of justice and becomes a theological view of poverty. So the poverty is interpreted in terms of Christ becoming poor and then our call to transformation. So there are just a few chapters. The first one is of just a few essential words, and it starts with the biblical story of the anointing at Bethany, where the woman comes in and pours very expensive, fragrant oil over Jesus, and the Pharisees are saying, oh, we should have kept this money that was wasted on this ointment and given the money to the poor. So why would we have this story? It's to show that love isn't efficient. You don't necessarily do the efficient thing. Jesus affirms love that's freely given, that's not reduced to pragmatism, whereas penny pinching in this case would be pragmatic. The model for this kind of love and outpouring is St. Francis. Now, since this document was begun by Pope Francis, this is obvious because he took the name Francis after St. Francis. And so St. Francis is this model of joyful poverty. The cry of the poor is a biblical and contemporary lament demanding response and challenging our lives, societies, political and economic systems, and the church. And there are many forms of poverty. There's material poverty, those who are socially marginalized. There's moral poverty, spiritual poverty, cultural poverty, personal or social weakness or fragility. There's people with no rights, no space, no freedom. And he names women as also subjects of poverty and the spread of inequality. So this cry of the poor is quite comprehensive in terms of who would be included. And he warns against ideological distortions of Christian service. And so he says you have to kind of call something, whether something is poor or not, depending upon what actual opportunities are available. So that if we're living in an affluent country, the standard of poverty is different than if you were living in a poor country. And he wants to avoid a meritocracy, which means only the successful, only those who merit are deserving of our care. So that's basically chapter 1. Chapter 2 is God's choice or election of the poor. And here the key theme is God's preferential love as part of salvation history. Jesus is the poor Messiah, and Christ's poverty is not symbolic, but it's embodied solidarity with God's people. And we have an account of biblical mercy that goes all the way from Moses to the prophets to the Gospels. And so mercy is part of covenant. It's not optional. And love of neighbor is proof of our love for God. And works of mercy are a sign of authenticity of worship. So, our worship is only as good as it sends us out on mission, if you will, to do that. Okay, I'm moving right along here because I don't have much time. Chapter 3 is about a church of the poor. And he goes through the history of how the church, through its religious communities and its corporate actions, has considered and worked for the poverty throughout history, starting with the scripture, going through the church fathers and mothers, and talking about all the service agencies that have been part of the service of the church. And of course, he also names a lot of religious communities who have had this as their focus. So then the next chapter is chapter 4 is the history that continues. And that's trying to get this to advance here. And that's the evolution of Catholic social doctrine, which started with Rerum Novarum by Leo XIII and included Mater Magistra from Pope John the 23rd up to Vatican II. And it's gone from concern over justice in terms of labor when it first got started to global justice with Mater Magistra, and Vatican II was concerned with the universal destination of goods and the social function of poverty. Then we have, after Vatican II, John Paul II, who reaffirmed the preference for the poor, and then to Benedict XVI, which was more of a political turn, and the need for social resources and economic institutions. And we end up with Francis, who was emphasizing ecclesial discernment to rethink the church's relationship with the poor. So it's a grand leap through church history and Catholic social teaching. It names the structures of sins, those systemic injustices that perpetuate poverty and inequality. And it denounces a dictatorship of an economy that kills. And that's what we're seeing in our contemporary period, that the forces of economics really have escaped in some ways political control of nations, and it's become transnational and global with fewer checks and balances. And the emphasis on everything is the poor as subjects, not objects of our care. So the poor are agents of renewal. They should be at the table and be actively involved in creating their own culture rather than simply being objects of charity. And we all need to be evangelized by the poor. So that's a really, really, really quick kind of move through that. And finally, the last chapter is the constant challenge, which goes back to a scriptural story of the Good Samaritan. This was one of Pope Francis's favorite parables. And it's actually all of chapter 2 in Fratelli Tutti. And Francis called it pure gospel, that if you were to encapsulate the gospel into one parable, it would be that of the Good Samaritan. And it calls for us to be close to suffering, for a moral proximity to suffering. And it says that every Christian community needs to engage in conversion of structures and habits. And it redefines almsgiving. In this time of Lent, this is really important because almsgiving is not just giving money, but it's reimagined as solidarity, justice, and societal transformation, not just giving out of our surplus. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, Susan. That's great. And it's good to see everybody. So I'd like to start with just one point that I think is the nub of my Ignatian and Jesuit reading of Dilexi Te, and that is to see social justice work as religious experience and therefore as joyful. Social justice as religious experience. So I'd like to start with two examples of Jesuit experience as I think examples of what Dilexi Te is about, and then share 2 or 3 insights about how using the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, Ignatian spirituality, sheds some interesting light on the exhortation. So one example, the first example I'd like to share is from a Jesuit general congregation. It's like a Jesuit parliament or council, if you will, in 1995. And one of its main tasks was to evaluate 20 years of faith justice experience, which was it was a commitment in 1975, inspired by the council and a few other things, to make social justice work a constitutive aspect of all of our ministry and life, not just one ministry among others. So evaluating, it was controversial, as you can probably imagine. And so 20 years later, this congregation evaluated the experience. It validated the commitment, but not from theological reasoning, not from moral reasoning, but from religious experience. So basically, there were 4 decrees on mission, and they all started like this: how the Jesuits met the crucified and risen Jesus in the poor, in social justice work, in enculturation, in interreligious dialogue. How we met Jesus and how we were transformed in each case, how we were transformed, what we were transformed from, and what we were transformed to. So, what did we have to lose? What did we have to let go of? What was the sin that we needed to be healed of? And then, what was the transformed form that we had because of encountering Jesus through social justice work, through enculturation, through interreligious dialogue? So, how did we find Jesus in all of those places? And how did we encounter Jesus inviting us to be there? Come, work with me. Come, learn here. Be changed, and so on. So that was the basic argument for faith justice that was made in 1995 was essentially we met Jesus there and we were transformed for the better. We met Jesus in the poor broadly understood, and we were transformed for the better. So that's kind of at the worldwide level. Here in Canada, we had a similar experience, I think, with our Indigenous relations. In 2015, so that was the year that the TRC finished its work, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We had a large-scale communal discernment exercise about what our priorities should be. We took about a week to do this. There were lay people, leaders of our ministries, Jesuits, people from the French Canadian province, an Indigenous elder, and so on. The first thing to emerge was spirituality, especially the spiritual exercises. That was not a surprise. However, the second priority to emerge was Indigenous relations, not Indigenous ministry, not our service of or ministry to Indigenous people, but our relationships, our friendships, our partnerships, a much larger category than Indigenous ministry. So it flowed from an insight into the 400 years of history of the Jesuits in Canada. And the insight was that we are at our best, that is, we're most Jesuit, when we're in right relationship with Indigenous people. And when we're at our worst, when we're not in right relationship with Indigenous people. So out of that flowed this commitment to Indigenous relations. So that meant seeing Indigenous people as friends, as partners, as teachers, and that relationship with Indigenous people should be part of our way of proceeding. In other words, not one ministry among others, but our schools, our universities, social justice offices, and so on and so forth, all should work somehow in some kind of relationship with Indigenous people, and that Indigenous people should have some input into Jesuit decisions. So at the end of that, and I think that was the beginning of our decolonization, although we didn't have the word then, but at the end of that meeting, an Indigenous elder got up and said, "Finally, I feel recognized. Finally, I feel like a friend." And she'd been working with us for 40 years. So in other words, she felt patronized by us for 40 years, but never gave up on us. So I think these are two examples of Jesuit connection with the poor, of being transformed by that connection, and of finding Jesus there in important ways. So those are my two examples. So in the second example, Indigenous people as subjects, not objects. Looking at the exercises and Ignatian spirituality in general. So in the spiritual exercises, there's different kinds of material, but the kind that appears most often is contemplations of Jesus. and getting to know Jesus through, especially through his active time in ministry, and yeah, getting to know him in a personal, intimate way, and slowly being transformed by that. So I think that's one. I think maybe that's an Ignatian way of looking at what the Pope is doing, contemplating Jesus through our contact with the poor, and that's always a transformative contact. And over the course of the exercises, these contemplations promote an increasing intimacy with Jesus and familiarity. Another kind of material that you find in the exercises are meditations, especially during the period of the exercises where you're with Jesus in his active ministry. And these meditations kind of deepen the relationship with Jesus and push it forward, and serve as important guides to decision making in the context of your relationship with Jesus. So there's a sequence or an evolution to these meditations, and they kind of go like this: from knowing Jesus's way of doing things, that would be the meditation on the two standards, to embracing Jesus's way of doing things. That would be the meditation on the three kinds of persons. Don't worry about the names there. And then finally, becoming attached to the person of Jesus in a love relationship. So that would be the meditation on the forms of humility. And the highest form of humility that's talked about in that meditation is where your humility with Jesus, or sorry, your commitment to being with Jesus is strong enough that you are willing to suffer because of that commitment. So if Jesus is in an awkward place, if Jesus is going through his passion, you're going to be there because you want to be with Jesus. So it's a choice for Jesus that embraces also the cost of discipleship, or that can involve all kinds of inconvenience and suffering and so on. But for the sake of love, not moral rectitude, which is a good reason. So that's I think that's what the meditation calls the third degree of humility, is an example, an Ignatian form, I think, of the relationship with the poor, with Jesus through the poor, that Pope Leo is advocating. And finally, the capstone or the completion of the exercises in the contemplation, the contemplatio, to love the way God loves, where ultimately everything is a means of experience of God and of growth in God, but where everything becomes sacramental. And so the line in Dilexi Te that caught me from this point of view is the sacramental presence of the Lord in the poor, so the poor as sacrament of Christ, and all material goods as instruments of charity, or if you will, of love and justice. That's paragraph 47. That makes me think of the contemplatio, where everything is a potential means of contact with the Lord, and therefore of being transformed. And so again, social justice work as religious experience, as experience of Jesus, especially through the poor. And that will mean suffering of one form or another. Certainly in terms of truth and reconciliation work, that's meant a lot of humiliation for us, for the Jesuits, and for the Church in Canada, but it's humiliation that has led to new life and new relationships. So I'll leave you with the same note that I began with. social justice work as religious experience, as transformative encounter with Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And back to Susan.
I'm going to share again. And this follows directly on what Peter just shared with us. Remember I'm canonizing him before his time. Pope Francis was a Jesuit. And so to see these Jesuit Ignatian themes should not be surprising to us. And just as Peter just talked about Christ's personal love for us, our personal love for Christ, this is what I think is a little different, or a new turn for this document, that it recenters Catholic social teaching explicitly on Christ's personal love. It frames every teaching on poverty and justice not as policy, but as a response to the personal love of Jesus. And I think this Christological grounding is much more explicit and much more affective, that it means involving our emotions, than most Christian Catholics, most Catholic social teaching documents. Secondly, we find here a deeper integration of spirituality and social action. And so it refuses to split prayer from justice. It stresses that poverty is a gospel reality demanding conversion, not just a social issue. And works of justice, as I said before, are signs of authentic worship in a way that explicitly frames the poor as sacramental signs of Christ's presence, just as Peter just told us that the poor are sacramental signs. I think it sometimes helps us to imagine a triangle where you have the Word of God, Scripture, as one point, sacrament as another point of the triangle, and then social action as a third point. That again, it's an integral part of living out the gospel, the Word of God. It is what sacraments should lead us to in the world today. We also have a stronger critique of ideology, both left ideology and right ideology. Meritocracy, as I said before, is described as inherently unable to see the poor as deserving of anything. And charity, which is either distorted by pragmatism or efficiency, is criticized through the lens of the scene of the anointing at Bethany. And so it rejects service that begins from ideology or policy rather than encounter with Christ. As I said before, there's a more expansive, detailed understanding of who the poor are. And those include women without rights, those with no social space or freedom, culturally marginalized groups, which in Canada here we've seen with Indigenous peoples, those in spiritual or moral fragility, victims of human trafficking, forced labor, and exploitation. So the list is much broader than classic Catholic social teaching and more aligned with Francis's concern for the existential peripheries. That means those at the edges. There is a continuity with prior Catholic social teaching, but there's a clear trajectory that we have here that ends up with discernment and structural conversion. There's a more urgent, detailed denunciation of structures of sin, which includes the dictatorship of economics, market autonomy, financial speculation, a throwaway culture, environmental degradation tied to poverty. And the sixth one, I'm not going to do these discussion reflections here, but the sixth one that is not listed on a slide is the stronger theological insistence that the poor are subjects, not objects, that they evangelize us, they shape culture, they don't just receive aid. And elsewhere, Francis has said they must sit at the table where decisions are made. So there's a shift from paternalism to co-responsibility, which is one of the document's most important contributions.
Thank you, Susan, for that background. How this document and its connection with Catholic social teaching and those points you bring up. So thank you both for these reflections of yours, and very complementary with one another. And I can see the wisdom in bringing you both together on this topic. Before we begin into questions, I just wonder if you, Susan and Peter, would like to follow up on anything yourselves. You would have a question for that either of you would have a question for the other. Oh, you're muted, Peter. Or anything you want to pick up on that the other said?
Well, I'm kind of making a joke here, but
That's okay. We need levity.
No, I'm really touched at how complimentary our presentations were without any prior consultation. I think the spirit's at work here.
Well, the spirit, but I also think it's Pope Francis. I mean, I don't think we can overestimate how influential his own Jesuit identity was to both his message and mission. So I think I see him all over this document.
Yeah.
And the fact that Leo penned it, put it out over his name, is a sign that he wants to continue the trajectory that Francis began.
Yeah. And not to take away from, the Ignatian Pope Francis sort of voice within this document, but what do you see of Pope Leo's voice as it's starting to emerge? Is there anything uniquely charismatic in this document of Pope Leo's that you can encapsulate in a sentence or two?
I can see his own pastoral experience in this document. He was a bishop in Latin America, and so he experienced that. Some of my sisters had lunch with him one day in Peru when he was going through on his way to visit some of his priests. And so I think this concern with the poor, he's very much attuned, as was Francis, to popular religion, and popular religiosity, I think is something that we're going to see from him, and his respect for cultures that are different. But I think he was formed by his pastoral experience. In a way, he was elected Pope because he checked all the boxes. He had pastoral experience. He had experience with bishops because he was in the dicastery for bishops. So he had the Vatican experience. He knew languages, but I think the cardinals were not posed to elect anybody who did not have pastoral experience. So I think that was central to his election.
I agree with that. You can feel that he's speaking from experience. It's not that he's simply read and kind of mastered the texts of Catholic social thought. He's lived the experience. So he's obviously relies on Augustine a lot. So that's part of what he will bring, intellectually and theologically and spiritually. But I think I agree with that. He's writing as a pastor from his experience as a pastor. And I think from the experience of the Latin American church and its huge, huge contribution to Catholic social teaching and Catholic social thought and practice in general.
And I think it's important to know the name he picked. He picked Leo. And so he's the 14th. And Leo the 13th was the one who started our Catholic social teaching tradition or trajectory with the encyclicals.
And on that point, I think Catholic social teaching, Catholic social thought is a sign of the times. It's relatively new, 100 and whatever, 50, 125 years old, let's say, ish. And it's not well enough known in the church, I think, but I think it's a real sign of the times. The Lord is at work there and inviting the whole church to engage in everything that Catholic social teaching is about. And, it's produced martyrs.
Someone pointed out to me that Leo the 13th came along at the time of the Industrial Revolution and was concerned with labor. Leo the 14th is coming in when the big question is artificial intelligence today. So I mean, there's kind of a symmetry from that point of view too.
Yeah, and the identity of the human being and the value of the human being in contrast to artificial intelligence, particularly human-like artificial intelligence, like through chats and, artificial intelligence companions, people looking towards that artificial intelligence for companionship, and Leo is very aware that what does this say about our need for human companionship, and in the context of a growing epidemic of loneliness and so on. The dignity of the human being for both in the context of the Industrial Revolution, but also in the digital revolution that we're experiencing. I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit about some things both of you had shared in your reflections. Beginning, you both said in various ways, seeing the poor sacramentally, contemplatively. And an image that came to me was photography. And Dorothea Lange in particular. And Dorothea Lange was an American photographer during the Great Depression. And she was commissioned by the Roosevelt government to take photos of people who were living and working in camps, migrant camps, people who were going across the country looking for employment, and very iconic photos, and very beautiful photos of the poor, quote unquote. But there was controversy because there was the risk of objectifying the poor and even romanticizing the poor because they're very beautiful photographs, idealizing the poor in a sense. And I guess that really, how can we speak of the poor, quote unquote, without objectifying them? That they're not objects, that they are subjects. And should we even be speaking them as they, as if I'm not the poor, I'm not, in that category of a human being? And I just wonder, is there anything in Dilexi Te that speaks about that's really getting at the heart of that? The poor are, first of all, they're us, I would say, in various ways, though we may not experience material poverty in comparison to other people, but there are different levels of poverty, or different kinds of poverty. But yeah, just how, from what your experience, how would Francis and or Pope Leo kind of look at that sort of dilemma that we have, they versus us, or not versus, but yeah, not objectifying the poor, not even labeling them the poor.
I'm going to pull a Jesuit comment here on thin ice. I think it has to do with accompaniment and friendship. I think you don't objectify when you walk with and you become friends with. And so it's creating relationships. I mean, that's what Peter said is so important with the Indigenous community. It's all about relationship building.
I think that's exactly right. And I think I hear that in Francis and in Leo. I think there's a danger to objectify or romanticize the poor. And I think the protection there is to get to know people. And then the us and them disappears. It's all us. So you're not thinking in terms of economic categories or sociological categories or the objects of policy, but you're thinking of friend so and so and friend so and so and so on and so forth. Real concrete people.
Yeah. And Anne pointed out in the chat, chapter 9 in particular, we can also look, addresses this kind of a question.
Paragraph 9.
Yeah. Oh.
There's no chapter 9.
Okay. I also wanted to explore, I think, Susan used love beyond efficiency. It's quite a statement. It's actually very imaginative, captivating. Imaginative love beyond efficiency. And another way that I would put that is prodigal love, and therefore the parable of the prodigal son. It's love freely given. It's not pragmatic, as you mentioned. And then either you or maybe it's taking off from Peter, joyful poverty. We have to watch how we, but the example of Saint Francis, and then I thought of the 3 degrees of humility in Saint Ignatius's exercises. It's an exercise, prayer exercise in the exercises themselves that comes. It's in the midst of the second week of the exercises, in which we're asked to contemplate how we live out our faith, the quality of our faith, more out of a sense of obligation. I go to Mass every Sunday because that's what's expected of me. That's how I grew up. And if I don't go, I'll feel the need to go to confession for not going to Mass, so that sense of obligation. And then the second degree, more out of a sense of, we want to live out our faith, but we're all kind of conflicted because we have all these other priorities in our lives, these other loves as well. Our love for our family, our hobbies, our work, and our faith life is just one aspect that we take seriously, but it's just one aspect of our lives. And then that third degree of humility, that really entering into it's almost like we forget everything else. Like our first priority is our faith. I mean, it's hard to categorize in this way, but we're willing to live out our faith even to the degree that of looking like fools for Christ, that we're prepared to live out our faith to the point of suffering, to the point of the cross, if we're called to that sort of depth of living out our faith. And to me, that's really kind of loving Christ beyond efficiency, beyond respect, being respected by society around us. So I guess it's kind of related. So this I have this question in this context. This is an apostolic exhortation. What are we being exhorted to do in this exhortation by Pope Leo and Pope Francis as well? what are we being exhorted? What kind of faith are we being exhorted to live out? Are we called to live out of a radical love, or yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe it's an unfair, hard question, but it is an exhortation. What does an exhortation mean in Catholic tradition, I guess you could say, and as opposed to an encyclical?
Well, there is an exhortation, but it's beyond duty, and it's beyond law, and it's I've studied a lot of Pope Francis, and in the early pages of Evangelii Gaudium, he tells us to encounter the Lord daily and let him gaze on us. And I think that still permeates everything he writes, because what he's asking for is that we have this personal relationship with Jesus Christ and experience Christ's love. That's the whole title of this thing, is I have loved you. Mm-hmm. And in the experience of love, we are then freed, and I think freedom is a big piece of it, to respond, and we respond in our relationships, with the poor. So we don't, and I think Francis would say we can't do that adequately at all unless we have that first religious experience. Mm-hmm. To go back to Peter's category of religious experience.
Yeah. I think it's all about love. So it's beyond duty, beyond law, and I think Leo is really pushing us beyond there. Like you say, the third degree of humility that goes beyond law, beyond duty. Doesn't exclude them, but there's a craziness to love. However, it's not a however, but it's never, the love of Jesus can never only be Jesus in me. It has to be Jesus and us. Mm-hmm. So there has to, if it's love of Jesus, and first of all, receiving Jesus's love, that is social, and that makes the church, and I think that's what we're being exhorted to. But mm-hmm. There's an image of love, that kind of love that I like from Forrest Gump. The movie Forrest Gump, where Forrest is he's piloting a gorgeous sailboat, kind of big. He's trying to bring it into dock, and all of a sudden he sees his friend on the dock. He forgets everything. He just makes a beeline for his friend. He jumps off the boat, swims to the dock. Meanwhile, he abandons the ship, and the ship is drifting and crashes into the dock. It ruins the dock and all that stuff. But all he cares about is his friend, and away he goes. So anyway, it doesn't mean there's not a place for efficiency or analysis or planning, but love, it has to begin in love and end in love, I think. Mm-hmm. And love is always social.
Yeah. Also, the Peter jumping out of the boat when he sees Jesus in the resurrection. It's all, yeah. And Peter, I'm looking at my notes, and I think it was you said. So I'm going to add this. I don't know if it's a quote from you or just how when you said social justice as religious work and therefore joyful, and we are being exhorted to joy-filled work. I don't know if that's a quote from you or not, but we are being exhorted to find joy in being with the quote unquote poor. And that's not easy, like in the fourth week of the exercises, they say of all the literature that is written about the exercises, the fourth week is the least written about, because joy is a really difficult because we're called to experience the joy of Christ in the first week, the risen Christ, in the fourth week of the exercises. And that's really, joy is such a, we can't force ourselves to joy. In the sense, we can't manufacture joy. And it's hard to find joy in being with the poor, like when you're with the homeless, and being with people who are suffering from mental disabilities and addictions. How do you see, how do we find the joy in that? Yeah, where's not the joy in the reality, but I guess joy in the accompaniment with, but yeah.
Well, if Jesus is there, there'll be joy.
Mm,
That doesn't I don't want to romanticize the problems or diminish the problems. The problems are real.
yeah.
Um, but if you're not going to attract people to social justice work or healing medicine or any kind of service, any kind of helping work, if you don't exude joy, if it's anger, if it's duty, which are good places to start, but it's not really going to be a witness unless you reach some kind of place of joy.
Mhm.
Jesus didn't go to Jerusalem. He knew it was going to happen, but I think he enjoyed his work. It was painful, it was difficult, it was demanding.
Mhm.
But his love of God and his love of everyone else was very strong. Yeah, so it's not to say that there aren't problems, and it's not to say that they aren't serious, but it's more about how we live our mission, I think.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Francis said that he at one point experienced joy and it never left him,
Mm, mm,
despite all the problems he had, that it was kind of an underlying, kind of, like these melodies that kind of are sustained underneath all the stuff that's happening on top, a sustinato or whatever it's called.
Mhm.
Musically, it's kind of like that. And I think sometimes we have a wrong sense of what joy is. I still think it's not Handel's Messiah. It's more consolation,
mm.
And so we can have an unrealistic expectation of what joy should look like. But
Mhm.
there's, I think it's quieter than that
Yeah.
in the fourth week, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember one of my profs saying, why is it that the art about there's so little art about the resurrection, but so much more about the crucifixion? I think of my gorgeous home parish. The stained glass windows of hell were really interesting. Lots of people, lots of action, lots of color, um, and the crucifixion too. But the resurrection is kind of vague, you know, watered down watercolors kind of thing. Because
Mhm.
we find it easier to understand pain and suffering than joy, I think. So
Mhm.
there's something radical and challenging to joy that you're putting your finger on there, Trevor, I
That's
think.
why it's easier to write a novel about conflict.
Yeah.
Mhm. I just want to take time, just so we're going to open it up to questions now for anyone, and just the usual Zoom way to put up your hand, digital hand. Don't put up your hand like this because we can't see everyone's screen at once. So if you put up your digital hand, if you have a question for Susan and or Peter,
Trevor, there might be some questions in the chat.
in the chat as well. You think there's some
I
already?
don't think so. I've been looking at it. It's
There's one from
the
Kim
questions
K.
that got asked got answered.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm. So while we're waiting for questions, maybe I can just say, what was I going to say? Um, I forget. I had something. It was about joy again. And Susie, it's not a gleeful joy that we're being called to, but more of like a quiet joy, the joy of consolation, the joy of when we're with those who we see as the poor. There's that inner feeling that it's good to be here. Even though it may not be a joyous experience in the sense of smiles, but there's an inner sense of, though it's difficult to be here in any given situation of impoverishment, it's good to be here, you know. Yeah, so I'll just, Rosemary.
I'm not sure if I can be heard. Technically, I'm not very good. Can I be heard? All right. Thank you very much. This was a wonderfully deep and fruitful reflection. It surpassed anything I've done lately, and I'm on a lot of Zooms. My question is, Laudato Si. What's the link? That powerfully affected and expanded the Christian imagination and the Christian authenticity and respect for the Pope. What do you see it ignored? In the sense that the poor is the earth, the green, and the threats to survival of the human being. Do you see it reflected in this Dilexi Te?
Well, I think one of the themes in Laudato Si is that the degradation of the poor leads to, of the earth leads to poverty.
Yeah.
And so there's a direct connection with what we do to the earth and the human condition. So, I think that's the line that gets drawn, or one of the lines.
It's true that ecology is mentioned a lot in the exhortation. It's there, but it's not mentioned a lot. That's true. But I wouldn't say it's being ignored. There's since the Laudato Si, there's been such an explosion of Catholic ecological organizations around the world, and in some places, new ways of organizing the church around biomes. Like the ecclesial network around the Amazon, similarly the Congo Basin, and a few other places. And I think the involvement of the dicastery for integral human development with your friend Rosemary, Michael Cherney, they're all over ecology. So I don't think, while it doesn't get big play in Dilexi Te, I think it's up there in the considerations and preoccupations of the Vatican.
I was muted. Thank you for that connection with Laudato Si. And yeah. Carmen stepped away. Carmen, I saw she stepped away.
Yeah. She'll be back, but she stepped away.
Okay, so Neil, how about you?
Well, thanks, Father Trevor. Thanks, Father Peter. Thanks, Susan. Actually, I'm glad because mine follows so nicely from what Rosemary said. So again, as she said, really interesting. I do a lot of webinars. This has been captivating, truly captivating. Really enjoyed it. But mine was going to be about Laudato Si as well. And part of what I see is this almost rebalances, because Laudato Si was all about the cry of the earth and cry of the poor, and it brought it together. I think, as Father Peter just said. But, ecology got the upper hand and the poor got the lower hand, if you will. And I think this is kind of a nice rebalancing and bringing that out. So, but my question was going to be about this. So John 23rd, see, judge, act. And I thought, Father Trevor, you got into this. What's this all about, exhortation? So I'm really interested in what we can do to act. And I say that just because when Laudato Si came out, I read it. I was working in the environmental field and I read it and I said, this is incredible. And I showed it to colleagues and I said, this is an incredible piece of work of seeing and judging. And the guy who wrote it's the head of my church too. And Catholics, non-Catholics, non-Christians all thought it was quite wonderful. But it took a long time for us to start acting. It seemed to me anyway. There wasn't very little dialogue, and then a whole industry, cottage industry has sprung up, and a good one. The Laudato Si animator LSAs, and now we have the anniversary, and now it's got a lot of momentum. But I'm wondering thoughts from Father Peter and Susan about just how do we act. I'll say one thing. I'm lead at our parish here in Ottawa. We have a Care for Creation committee, and we've spent the last 10 years largely on the environmental side, and now this has got us rethinking and refocusing on the cry of the poor. But the two seem to be so integral, as an integral ecology would say. So how do we act? Thank you.
I'll jump in there, Susan. First of all, I think that the C and the judge have to be also discerning. So reading the signs, not simply social analysis, which we need, but social analysis and discernment of the signs of the times, and that's also how we need to make the judgments, and then the actions. Certainly in the church in Canada and in, I think, much of the Western world, there is the social justice sector seems to be shrinking in the church, just because resources are shrinking, less money, less personnel. And I think the faith, justice, grace is changing too, along the directions of Dilexi Te, and our organizations haven't caught up to incarnate that grace. I'm thinking out loud here, and I think I'm getting lost. So I'll hand it over to you, Susan. So I think the church social justice sector, especially among religious communities, it needs support, I think. Susan?
I would just say that I think it starts local. I think the same thing about synodality, that both, work for justice and work for listening and work for inclusivity. I think it's the most important stuff is going to be local, and it's going to filter up, not down. Mm-hmm. So you have to, the look, see, and act is what's in your backyard, and what can be done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, in terms of Canada, I think that's what got the bishops on board with inviting the Pope for the apology and truth and reconciliation. I think that came from the ground up, with much help from things like the blanket exercise and listening to Indigenous voices and other things like that.
Good. Thank you, Neil, for your question. And I'm going to go back to Carmen in a moment, though. Carmen, I just want to, in a couple observations in the chat that I'd just like to read out from Sandy. I have experienced joy as a fullness in my heart, but I can't explain it really at all. It's a mystery. It's not happy so much as it is a peace that I do not understand but accept in gratitude. And I felt it when serving the homeless and needy in and out of the cult program at a parish. And Earl speaks of is not joy the incarnated presence of Christ, who is present in all aspects of our lived experience. I agree that it's more often experienced as a consolation, including a movement of willful agreement with God's invitation to create the condition of God's kingdom on earth. So, Thank you for those observations, Sharon, Sandy, and Earl. And feel free to continue, everyone, because not everyone likes to, so many people vocalize their questions or observations. So, Carmen. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I would like just not to ask a question, but especially to say about my experience. Right now, we are with my husband in Bolivia. After a month of spiritual exercises, we were called to work as in pastoral in the jail. One of the jails. It is the worst, the most dangerous, they say. So we were called, and so that's what we do with a Jesuit priest, and also with a group of new friends that are just joining to our group. It's so recent, it's so new. But what I want to say is about the sacramental experience. When we participate in the Eucharistic celebration, from the very first Sunday, to give the embrace of peace to each one of the prisoners, it just filled my heart with joy, embracing them strongly, a warm embrace to each one, and each telling me sister, and same thing to Roger, brother, sister. So they're all brothers and sisters. This is for me a sacramental encounter. Mm-hmm. And of course, a sacramental encounter, it is a joyful, as it was just mentioned right now, for somebody that was saying we cannot explain joy, because it is such a powerful presence of the Lord. There's no words. It just wants to expand your heart so big you can't even hold it in. So I was just wanted to mention about sacramental and joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. Would you like to, Peter or Susan, would you like to respond in any way to?
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
Mm-hmm. I like that. A key word I think there that Carmen brings up is expansion. I think that's maybe another way we can look at joy, is it somehow expands ourselves beyond ourselves. It kind of moves us out of ourselves into the company of one another, through our love for God, there's that expansion. Yeah. Thank you, Carmen. Sister Leslie. I think you're muted. Yeah.
I'm very happy to be participating in this conversation. At the same time, I feel, maybe not angry. I'm not going to be angry, but I feel hurt. I feel hurt because of the word that is used constantly, the poor, that you reach out to the poor, the poor. That is such an insult to anyone who is oppressed, who is marginalized. That using an adjective objectifies. There are people who are economically poor, who are spiritually poor, who are being oppressed, but they're people. And I find, when I read the document, I put it down to translation and using the poor, but it really hurts to hear the poor when they're my friends or my family, and no, they're not the poor. I think we have to just broaden or use a few more words, and it's okay. But they're people. That's it.
I agree with you. It's the language is in some ways the opposite of the point that's being made, that, excuse me, the poor are subjects, not objects. You know, which is the basic teaching of the document. But we get tripped up with language all the time, and it sometimes betrays us. So thank you for your comment.
I think that's a really important comment too. And I agree, the language undermines the central point.
And I would say I'm just as guilty of using that language, and I try to be mindful of it, because, you know, even some in my own family would be easy to categorize them as under this category of the poor. And if they were in the same room, say one of them was here in this webinar, you know, and they heard me talk like that, I'm sure they were, is Trevor talking about me? Am I, you know, I won't say who, you know, but, and I would not want them to think that, you know. It's a struggle because I think we're all poor in various ways. But to even say that, it diminishes poverty, you know, like it's like we're all poor. Well, if we're all poor, then no one's poor, you know, like the level. So it's, you know, but so I try to look for different, you know, the needy or the, yeah. We have to watch these big categorical terms, because I remember when, you know, even in Indigenous circles, someone mentioned to me in Indigenous, be careful even using the word Indigenous, because it's a catch-all, you know, of all Indigenous peoples. Like Indigenous peoples, generally speaking, are very unique in their own ways. They come from different communities, different tribes, and so on. So it's, yeah, language. Earl.
I think I'm off mute so people can hear.
Yeah.
The present context of my life is Our Lady of Lourdes in downtown Toronto. And very soon after I arrived, just under 2 years ago, I found myself challenged through the Gospels in my prayer to reach out to my neighbors who live on the streets and sidewalks and back alleys of Toronto. And what I experienced is two things, which are, it is the way of life. I have found in my conversations that the street, here I go again, here we go, the poor, they who live on the streets, they really struggle to take care of one another. So there's a generosity in the manner that they share their last smoke or whatever it is they have that's not too great in material terms. I also wish to recognize that some of these persons who live on the street can be very mean. And so in view of the gospel, where there's the unconditional response of Jesus, who reached out to persons who have human need, who have human wants, regardless of their moral fiber or fabric, you know. The point I'm struggling to make is that Jesus preferred or he was a poor man who lived among persons who were largely subsistence in the manner that their conditions of their lives. But it was precisely because they had need, they had want, and God means to care for we who are human, irrespective of our moral standings, of our way of living, and that to me is mind blowing, because it breaks down so many more of the categories that I often live, and the biases and prejudicial notions I have in reaching out to neighbors, and how I approach people on the street. Well, am I going to say hello or give from my pocket something because this person is worthy? It's not a question of being worthy. It's a question of absolute need, that God reaches and prefers the poor. I think that's enough for me to say. Otherwise, I'll continue to ramble on. But if anyone can help me clarify what I'm trying to say, I'd be glad. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl.
Speaking.
Any response, Peter or Susan?
No, thanks. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Before we go to our next question, Unite, if I'm pronouncing your name right, I just want to, a few things in the chat came forward. I'd just like to call out. It is what struck me today when read in the exhortation. There is told the situation of St. Francis embracing the leper. In point 6, it is said that in this situation, Christ is embracing in the leper St. Francis. This turns things around. Not we are acting with the poor, but Christ is in embracing us in this encounter. So there's, drawing our attention to Christ within us and working through us and recognizing Christ and in others. Monica says regarding language, the poor, I agree. She agrees with kind of what the struggles we're expressing it. I interpret that as, but I also think it's helpful to think in terms of groups. We aren't only talking about individuals, but rather a group of people who are made poor mostly due to structural factors and sometimes with intention. Maybe some better language to keep it humanized and recognize the idea of a group could be something like, quote, those living in poverty, unquote, quote, those made poor, unquote, or just, quote, working on poverty, quote, rather than working with the poor. Thank you for that, Monica, looking at those. And then Sandy, humility and joy go together. Humility comes gratitude and seeing God in all things. Also, no one likes to be called poor. It is divisive. The goal is unity and unifying and reconciling love, and that does not happen with divisive language. We are all poor, and at any point, at any time, we who think are not poor can become poor. So that's, yeah. Thank you, Sandy, kind of pointing out the vulnerability of our situations. We can't take anything for granted. And so, thank you. Unite, if I'm pronouncing your name right.
My name is Malcolm Nazareth.
Okay.
I'm one of your southern neighbors in Minnesota. And
welcome.
and I want to make a point about the political situation in the country and the context in which both Pope Francis as well as Pope Leo have made their contributions to the issue of dealing with poverty and structural poverty and all that, and the love for the poor. Now, I'm thinking of Trumpism as the context which has defined where I see myself right now. And Dilexi Te has come at a very providential moment where the people who are, first of all, Trumpism pauperizes everybody eventually. And it creates the context for everybody to be thrown into that category in all possible ways. And it also does the same with the ecology. Trumpism is anti-ecology. So this is the context in which this document comes from a person who is from both Peru and from the United States, a dual citizen person who understands the whole situation so well that the document is a classic. It addresses precisely the situation in which I find myself, and I think many of us find ourselves, where a Project 2025, which undergirds Trumpism in a very blatant and clear way, destroys everything possible which is valuable with regard to the life of people who are struggling with poverty, people who are dealing with an environment which is being destroyed before our very eyes, and destruction of anything democratic, which is meant to be something which enables people to live and respect with each other and live with dignity. So I find this so moving that this document from Pope Leo has come at this time. It touches very deep strings in what's going on in the world, and it gives so much of credibility to the church, which brings me to the what I see in the church in the United States. I have found, unfortunately, that the bishops were just sleeping or mute in their approach to the issues of the times. And with Pope Leo's Dilexi Te, suddenly some things have begun, voices have begun to be emerging among the bishops. You had some extraordinary utterances recently, and one begins to see more of movement now, beginning with voices, and I'm sure it will move more into action. There has been a lot of action, of course, in the United States at subtle and overt levels, but we needed a strong voice to tell people, go ahead, you're doing the right thing. Go and deal with the structures of oppression which are being put into place by Project 2025 and Trumpism. I just wanted to make this point as something which is very important to me at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Susan or Peter, would you like to?
Well, I think what it shows is all these documents are addressed to specific contexts and times. You know, they're historical documents that years from now, you look back at the point of history where they were written and how they spoke to that point of history. One example is that, like when we read Vatican II today, to realize that Gaudium et Spes was composed in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War, you know, it gives us another way to read that document. And I think today, you know, I watch the news every night and hope we're not headed to World War III. You know, is that so? To give a message of love when there's so much hate and concord and strife, that's certainly a prophetic announcement. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I noticed you were from St. Cloud, Minnesota. I lived in that neighborhood for 13 years, so I was happy to see somebody from my past.
And Susan, you were also at the Ecumenical Institute, right?
Yes,
So we were neighbors and we were compatriots at that time, resident scholars
so
at St.
anyway,
John's.
It's nice to connect with you again.
And that's Mariani sitting here next to me. Susan Wood, I remember you so well.
Thank you for your comment.
Welcome.
A statement from, you know, a higher authority like the Pope can really support what's going on at the grassroots and encourage kind of the middle level leadership. So I noticed after the Pope came to Canada, inside the Catholic Church, it was much easier to talk about truth and reconciliation. Up until then, we were kind of walking on eggshells. So yeah, stuff from you know, the grassroots is important, but stuff from on high can really open up the way.
Yeah, I certainly agree. It's sometimes I can get a bit, you know, what should I say about this or that? You know, just on my own behalf, but as a Catholic priest and as a representative of the Jesuits. And sometimes I feel, am I speaking out of turn? And and the different sort of expressions and writings of Pope Francis is how I would put it, has given me license, permission to speak on behalf of certain issues, and if anyone argues with me, provided I interpreted it well enough, I said, well, you're arguing with the church then, because I'm not, it's not just me saying these things, but I have support from Francis, or Pope Leo, or, whatever. So, but it also is encouraging, as Malcolm was pointing out, once such a document like this comes about, it's a bit of like an energetic sort of jolt to the local hierarchy to begin to to get them into action, to to kind of echo their the words from these papal documents. So yeah. Before Marianne, just one moment, I just want to point out a couple of other things in the chat. I'm not going to read but I just from Sean, the poor, the servile, and the humble. So he points out. I won't read the whole thing, but also Kim points out, it's a question, any suggestions on how to bring this exhortation to young people, to youth?
It's easy.
Well, there was an answer to that. Chapter 3 has some great potential. That was the answer to the question. No, I just asked them what is their experience.
Mm-hmm.
To go to their experience, not try to impose our experience on their experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's true, and I also think young Catholics today would be attracted to the message of this exhortation. They might not be attracted to the language or to reading a text that's it's not that long, but well, anyway. But in terms of how to make it more accessible, I don't really know. But I think there's an attraction to popular devotion. There's an attraction to concrete spirituality. There's an attraction to a personal relationship with Jesus.
Yeah. And also, too, I'm thinking of like helping to facilitate relationships with younger people and quote unquote the poor, and I'm thinking, for example, when I was in Winnipeg in my regency, the grade 7 and 8 teacher, Brenda Probitz, I'll call her out. She's not on this webinar, I don't think, but we would go once a month with the grade 8s to visit a nursing home. And we would actually walk, even in the winter in Winnipeg, we would walk to the nursing home, about 20-minute walk, a whole class, and we would spend the afternoon with the residents, and we would pair them up. So, and they would meet with the residents, and some of whom were, like in any nursing home, some of whom didn't have a lot of family, they didn't get a lot of visitors. So it's, yeah, no, I think that, and we're helping to facilitate relationships for grade 8s who, whose grandparents were younger at that age, but now they were developing relationships with the more vulnerable, and so that was really rewarding for me to help to, to connect youth with vulnerable peoples and that particular situation,
But I think also in their own social circles, young people can be enormously cliquish in terms of who their friends are and who's in the in crowd and who's in the out crowd and who's popular and who's not popular. And are you a sport jock or are you a cheerleader, or, and to challenge, to break down some of those social barriers that are even strong within a youth culture would be important.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You know, Marianne.
The homeless is a category that I work with, and I know like any category we see in our community, we have stand on otherisms, and I think we all do it in many different ways. But right now, working with the homeless is one example. And where do I get joy? Like years ago, I was involved in a retreat center, and we had a weekend retreat, and the people that were in the group that met together just before lunch, someone who didn't share her pain for 20 years had the courage to share that pain. And at lunch, somebody walked up to me and said, "I'll pray for you because you're listening to a lot of pain." And I didn't feel that. I felt joy in that, the group, she gained the trust in the group, developed, and that this person was able to voice something that they carried for so long. I just felt great joy with that. And in meeting people, there are many people that are refugees. And just a couple of days ago, one from Sudan and one from Eritrea. They carry great joy, even though I know they're in tremendous pain. They're separated from their families. They're not able to communicate with them. So to just, I affirmed them for the joy that they shared in playing bingo with the group. This is not very profound, but I think that's a part of where I get the joy in my ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Marianne, that reminds me, I'll try to be quick about this, of an experience I had when I was a novice in St. Paul, Minnesota, and my second year novice, and my ministry was visiting the hospital and working on the chaplaincy team, though I wasn't a trained chaplain at the time, and I wasn't ordained yet at this time either. And I just went around visiting patients that were on a list, Catholic patients, and just to visit. And I remember walking in to visit one woman, and she was sitting in front of the window, a big window overlooking the city. And she was, how do I put it? She cared about her appearance, but not in a vain way. But she wasn't going anywhere, but she was dressed as if she was going to go out, and we just got to talking with one another. And she had and she was sitting in the sunlight. I just remember visually, she was sitting in the sunlight in front of that big window. And that in contrast to describing her illness, an advanced stage of cancer. Her husband died a few years before that of a cancer as well. One of her sons committed suicide a year before that. And her other son was not doing well because his father had just died, his brother had committed suicide, and his mother, who I was visiting, was in advanced stages of cancer. And the grace that she was sharing this story with me, but there was a joy within her that, and it just symbolizes by her sitting in the sunlight in that big window, and then after about 20 minutes, she says, "Enough about me. You sound like you live an interesting life," because I was describing how I was from Canada and I was there and I was a Jesuit, scholastic, and she immediately turned to me. But there was just a joy, and it just brightened my day. But it was not. She was in advanced stage of illness, and her family was not well. But the way she bore it, and not everyone can do that, of course, but it just, I was thinking of that image when you were speaking, Marianne. It's
And something I was going to say, and I forgot that part. When you mentioned Minnesota, there was a webinar last week, and I can't remember the exact title, but it had neighboring as a movement and what the positive effect of what was happening in Minnesota how neighbors really supported, and everybody was their neighbor. There was no, you know, somehow homes opened their home to as many as 40 people to stay out of harm.
Yeah.
So that there was that. If you get a chance to see it, it's very powerful. And it's not just Catholic; it's
Mhm.
people who are experiencing the spirit of neighboring.
Mhm. Yes, I read about that too. What the sustaining power of what was taking place in Minnesota was because it was local. People defending neighbors, the people that they meet in the street every day in the stores. And it wasn't just based out of ideals, but it was a local initiative. And nothing empowers us more than standing up for our neighbor, and that was what was taking place from what I read in Minneapolis. Yeah. Good. I think I'd just like to back to the chat again. I just want to read out. Let's see. There's a lot of things here. Anne, in response to reaching out to the poor, says the Newman Center, RCIA, and Catholic Christian Outreach are active groups where you could unleash your desire to connect with youth who are keen to hear about these topics as Catholics. And Hugo, all it was said about the work with First Nations, I see that with my work with refugees, the need of reconciliation, the consolation in my work, the need to quote unquote humiliate myself or themselves, and the need of relation of walking with them, etc. And Earl, we need to provide young people with an experience of persons with essential needs. Social outreach initiatives are many. There's many opportunities. And then Cameron, I believe that capitalism marginalizes us all, but those people who have been forced out of their homes through capitalism, capitalist mechanisms, and may rely on substances to survive, we may identify that reality experiences those marginalized by capitalism or equity deserving people surviving poverty. I think when we encounter conflict, anger, violence from those living on the margins, we have a responsibility to balance with generosity, patience, and grace with boundaries. If we are open to it, we can learn much by leading with an intention of connection and compassion. And then Kim says, thanks for all these stories and witness. It's a big question, but any more you can say about the link between this exhortation and ecological conversion? More specifically, how might you link it to the Southern Catholic Episcopal Conferences and their call to bishops in the North to be engaged concretely in co-responsibility care for a common home? So we did talk about Laudato Si a little earlier, but maybe in light of this question, is there anything more you could, Susan or Peter?
No, except to say that I think if we want to see leadership in the church, we should look to the South. I am very impressed what's coming out of the Southern Catholic Episcopal Conferences in Salem. So I think we should keep our eyes on that.
Yeah. Could you say what's coming out in particular?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't speak or read Spanish, so I feel personally impoverished in that respect. But they were very involved in the process on synodality. And what they're moving towards is, I think, a church structure that we would call an ecclesial assembly rather than an episcopal synod. So they're taking what Francis did in terms of inclusive voices at the Synod on Synodality by including lay people, giving them a vote, having everybody sit around tables, equal in dignity with intentional listening and speaking, and turning that into an ecclesial structure for their conference. And so you contrast that with the northern Western Hemisphere in terms of both Canada and the United States. There was minimal involvement in the synodal process comparatively. When you compare that to South America or Asia or Africa. So I think we need those of us, sometimes it's hard to see beyond our own backyard and our own culture. But what's happening in these other parts of the world, I think, is very forward looking in the church today.
Yeah. Thank you. Peter, you're muted if you're
on connecting the exhortation to ecology. Well, reread a little bit of your Teilhard de Chardin, and that will help give you some inspiration. Finding Jesus in creation and in the cry of the poor that's coming from the earth. And there's always a social dimension to it, and there's always an ecological and social dimension. Yeah. But I think the leadership from the southern parts of the church is going to be really important. It'll probably affect Rome before it affects us. I mean, I suspect, but I might be wrong there. Interestingly, when Terence Prendergast was apostolic administrator, I think, of Cochrane. Trevor, do you remember? It wasn't Cochrane.
Moosonee Cochrane, yeah.
Yeah, Moosonee Cochrane. He published a pastoral statement on the north. So it was kind of the spirituality of the boreal forest and our responsibility for it and for all of the people who live in and with the boreal forest. Yeah, so if he can do that, then other bishops in Canada can too. Of course, he did it with help, but anyway, there's help available.
Yeah. Good. I have one more question, and then we'll conclude. And we did switch the format. Our intention was to have a sharing circle. I'd mentioned that, but I think the questions were going in this larger group, and I didn't really want to cut off the energy. So anyway, I don't know if that was a good decision or not, but anyway. But my final question, maybe in conclusion, to you, Susan and Peter, is in one or two sentences, what is the meaning of Dilexi Te? Not the literal meaning of the word, the phrase, but what do we take away in one or two sentences, like an elevator speech? What's the heart of the message of Laudato Si that you would like us to leave with?
I have one sentence. As I have loved you, love one another.
Gospel.
There you go. I was going to say Jesus and us.
Okay. Thank you so much. We can't forget about the Gospels. We're called to live out the Gospels, Christ. So thank you so much, Susan and Peter. We're very grateful for your presence with us and this exchange. And so, yes, that's
thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Trevor.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
Everyone for coming.
Great to be with you.
And just to know, this is being recorded, so you can go back on our YouTube channel and our website if you want to go back if you missed part of it, or to share it with others. So have a good day, everyone. Have a blessed weekend. Continued Lenten blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.